In the darkness, there are those who pray to be forgotten, and those who cannot forget, no matter how many centuries pass. The chapel smelled of stone dust and abandonment. Eleanor had stopped counting the days somewhere between the third and fourth week. Time became irrelevant when you could not see it passing. Her fingers traced the cold marble beneath her, following the grooves worn by centuries of pilgrims who had knelt here seeking salvation. She was seeking only silence. They had left her at dawn. She remembered the sound of their horses, the brittle laughter of the village priest, the way her father's footsteps had hesitated at the threshold before retreating into the world she could no longer perceive. Blind daughters were curses in 1742, unmarriageable, dangerous. The chapel was mercy, they said, God's house. She would be cared for by the sisters who visited on feast days. The sisters had not come in 43 days. Her voice had grown hoarse from prayer. The water pitcher, knocked over on the second week, had left a dark stain on the stone that she could not see but could smell, a reminder of waste, of her own carelessness. Breadcrumbs littered the floor where she sat. She had rationed everything, learning the geometry of hunger with the precision of a mathematician. 1 piece every sunrise, 1 sip of rainwater from the basin when the storms came. But the rains had stopped. Eleanor's lips had begun to crack. Her ribs pressed against her skin like fingers counting her remaining days. She had memorized every crack in the chapel's acoustics, the way sound bent and died in the eastern corner, how her voice magnified near the altar, how silence tasted different at night, thicker, like velvet pressing against her ears. She had stopped calling for help. Prayer was different. Prayer was a conversation with emptiness, and in that emptiness she had found something close to peace. She no longer asked God to rescue her. She asked him to make it quick. On the 44th night, she heard footsteps, not the careful, weighted steps of priests. These were deliberate, slow, moving through the chapel as if measuring something invisible. Eleanor's breath caught. Her fingers gripped the stone beneath her. Bandits? Grave robbers. She was beyond fear, beyond everything, except the terrible, clarifying awareness of her own fragility. You are still alive. The voice came from the darkness, but it did not sound surprised. It sounded like someone confirming something they had always known. It was deep, accented with something Eleanor could not place. Not entirely English, not entirely anything human. I am, she whispered. Her voice was barely recognizable to her own ears. How long has it been? I cannot count anymore. There was a silence. Eleanor heard him move closer, and every muscle in her body prepared for violence. Instead, she heard him kneel. The sound of his knee-striking stone was gentle, almost reverent. They told me a blind child had been brought to this chapel, he said. I did not believe they would abandon her. Even this world has limits to its cruelty. You were misinformed. Eleanor's tone was sharp despite her weakness. There are no limits. He laughed, a sound like wind through ruins. No, I suppose there are not. His hand moved toward her face, and Eleanor flinched. But he did not touch her. Instead, he held his palm near her cheek, and she felt the coldness radiating from him, a cold that was not the chill of stone or winter, but something else entirely, something ancient. What is your name? He asked. Eleanor, of the Ashford line, though the line ends here. I am the last embarrassment. She heard herself speaking and did not recognize her own voice. It was bitter, resigned, almost mocking. I am Dmitri, he said, and I do not believe in endings. Only in moments where the world stops holding its breath. Are you here to rob me, then? I have nothing but a dress that no longer fits, and prayers God stopped listening to long ago. I am here because I heard you. The words should have meant nothing. But Eleanor felt something shift in the chapel's geometry, as if the darkness itself had changed direction. Heard me praying? She did not know why she asked. She knew what he meant. "No," Dmitri said quietly. "I heard you deciding not to. I heard the moment you stopped asking for mercy and started accepting the absence of it. That sound. It carried very far." Eleanor's throat tightened. "And what do you intend to do with this information?" When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It contained something that sounded like sorrow, like recognition, like the meeting of two people who had walked through darkness long enough to know its shape by heart. "I intend to ask if you would like to survive the night." But the question held a weight she did not yet understand. Survival, from this stranger, from this voice in the darkness, would not be simple. It would be a choice between two eternities, one slow and merciful, the other vast and irreversible. And in that chapel where she had learned to hear silence, Eleanor began to understand that mercy and damnation often wore the same face. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Chapter 2. The Weight of Eternity. Eleanor did not move. Survival had become theoretical. She was not certain she still wanted it. But curiosity, that ancient curse, awakened something in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked, and her voice carried no fear now, only a strange lucidity that hunger and despair had taught her. "Someone who has heard many prayers," Dmitri answered, "but rarely one that stops asking and simply accepts the silence. That takes a particular kind of courage. That takes a particular kind of surrender. Yes, they are often mistaken for one another." He moved again, and this time Eleanor heard him remove something, a flask, perhaps, or a vessel. The sound of liquid being poured into a cup was almost violent in its normalcy. "Drink," he said, and placed the rim against her lips. The water was cool, but tasted strange, metallic, with an undertone she could not name. She drank anyway because thirst had no pride. It ran down her throat and spread through her body like fire and ice, warring for dominion. "What was that?" she asked, coughing. "Something to sustain you, for now." Eleanor wanted to ask what "for now" meant, but her body had already begun to change. The pain that had become her constant companion, the ache of hollow ribs, the burn of her throat, the way her thoughts had grown thin and scattered, all of it retreated like a tide moving away from shore. In its place came something else: clarity, power, hunger of a different kind entirely. "How do you feel?" Dmitri asked. "Like I am dying differently than before," Eleanor said. He made a sound that might have been approval. "That is honest. I prefer honesty to grace. Come." He extended his hand, and Eleanor, who had not been touched in weeks except by the chapel's cold stones, hesitated. But she took it. His skin was ice, not painful, but shocking in its absolute lack of warmth. He pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness, given the strength she could feel coiled in him. "I cannot see," she reminded him. "No, but you hear what others cannot. In darkness, that is a greater asset than vision." He guided her forward, and she walked without fear because she had already surrendered to whatever this night would become. The chapel has held you long enough. They moved through corridors Eleanor did not know existed. The chapel had been her entire world, and now it opened into passages she could hear the shape of by their acoustics. Arches, high ceilings, the smell of earth and very old stone. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Away from places where you are expected to die quietly." Dmitri's voice held something like anger. "I have spent 300 years watching the world forget what compassion means. I will not watch it claim you as well." Eleanor stopped walking. 300 years, yes. The number should have terrified her. Instead, it made sense in a way nothing else had. Of course he was ancient. His voice carried centuries. The cold of him was not the cold of winter, but the cold of time itself. "What are you?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" Dmitri turned toward her, and she sensed his face very close to hers. You were already dead. The chapel was simply a slow way of finishing what the world began. You could be anything, a demon, a creature of damnation. Yes, and you were a curse to your own family simply for being born unable to see. Both of us are damned. The question is whether we remain alone in that damnation. Eleanor's hand was still in his. She could feel the pulse of him, not beating, but present, like a low thrumming that existed beneath the surface of things. If I leave this chapel, she said carefully, I can never go back. I can never see my family again, or pretend that I was what they needed me to be. No, Dmitri agreed. You cannot, but you will see something else, not with eyes, with something deeper. Eleanor thought of the chapel's darkness, which had been total but also strangely alive, filled with sound, texture, meaning. She thought of her father's hesitation on the threshold. She thought of the priest's brittle laughter. Will it hurt? She asked. Yes, Dmitri said, but it will be a different hurt, a necessary one. The hurt of becoming something other than what the world decided you should be. Eleanor nodded, though he could not see it, but perhaps he could. Perhaps that was part of what he was. Then take me, she said, and tell me what I am becoming. Dmitri lifted her hand to his face. His cheek was smooth, cold as moonlight on water. You are becoming eternal, but first, you will learn to taste blood and choose mercy anyway. That is the real darkness, Eleanor, not the absence of light, the presence of hunger, and the decision to refuse it. He led her deeper into the earth, where the chapel's echoes could no longer reach, and Eleanor heard her own heart beating in this new darkness, strong, insistent, alive. And she understood, finally, why the world feared the immortal. It was not because they were monsters. It was because they remembered what it felt like to be human and refused to stop caring. Like if you'd choose eternity for love that sees your soul. Chapter 3. The first night. They emerged into a space Eleanor recognized not through vision, but through the way sound moved. A grand hall, perhaps, or a ballroom abandoned long ago. Dust moved in patterns she could feel through the air. The ceiling rose so high that her voice, when she tested it, traveled and returned almost as an echo of something else entirely. A castle? She asked. Once, Dmitri said. Now it is simply a refuge. I have lived in many places across the centuries, but I have found that castles understand the language of solitude better than cities ever will. They are built for isolation, for watching the world from a distance. Eleanor moved through the space carefully, building a map in her mind. Her blindness, which had always been a void, now felt like a different kind of seeing. She understood the architecture through acoustics, through the smell of old fabric and wood and stone, through the way temperature shifted as she moved. How many nights have you spent here alone? She asked. Enough to forget what alone means, Dmitri answered. Eleanor stopped. You are lonely. It was not a question. She could hear it in the way he breathed, slowly, deliberately, as if each breath was a decision rather than a reflex. The loneliness of someone who had stopped expecting connection centuries ago. Loneliness and I are old companions, Dmitri said. We understand each other well enough to coexist peacefully. Eleanor turned toward his voice. That is the saddest thing I have heard, and I have spent 6 weeks waiting to die in a chapel. He moved closer. You are more blunt since drinking from me. The water contained something of yours. Not water, blood. My blood, diluted with wine and herbs to ease the transition. You are beginning to transform, Eleanor, slowly but inevitably. Soon you will hunger in ways you cannot yet imagine. Eleanor felt the truth of it moving through her, the thirst that went deeper than throat, deeper than stomach. It was a thirst of the cells themselves. of something essential that her body had suddenly awakened to need. "What do I do?" she asked. "You learn. You practice restraint. You understand that hunger is not command. It is invitation, and you may decline." Dimitri's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. The young vampires, the ones who are turned by rage or vanity, they believe their hunger is irresistible. They are fools. Everything can be resisted. Some things simply cost more than others. And what does restraint cost? A life that watches other lives pass by like pages in a book. A memory that grows cruel with detail. The knowledge that everything you love will become dust before you are remotely tired of existing. Eleanor absorbed this. She reached out blindly, and Dimitri guided her hand to a chair. She sat, feeling the weight of ages settling around her like fabric. "Why save me?" she asked quietly. "If eternity is so terrible, why not leave me in the chapel to finish what the darkness had begun?" There was a long silence. Eleanor heard him move to a window. She could tell by the way the air changed, becoming thin and cold and edged with something like starlight. "Because 300 years ago, I was left behind as well," he said finally. "My daughter came to find me after I had disappeared into this life. She was older than I was when I was turned. Time moves strangely for those who love the immortal. She found me here in this castle, and she asked me why I had not come home. Why I had not tried to save her from growing old without me." Eleanor heard his hand press against the stone. "What did you tell her?" "That I was already dead. That she would be safer knowing that than discovering it slowly over decades." His voice was hollow. "I told her I was a mercy. She told me I was a coward. She was right. I have spent 3 centuries hiding in castles and old ruins, telling myself that loneliness was a choice rather than a punishment. But when you prayed in that chapel, when you decided that death was preferable to waiting for a mercy that would never come, I heard my daughter's voice again. I heard it saying that I was refusing her the choice." "So you saved me," Eleanor said slowly, "because you could not save her." "Yes, and because I am tired of being alone. And because mercy, real mercy, means letting someone choose their own damnation rather than making them choose yours." Eleanor stood. She walked toward his voice, toward the window and the cold, and the sense of him standing at the edge of something vast. She reached out again, and this time she found his face, his jaw, the impossible coldness of him. "Then let me choose," she said. "Teach me to live like this. Teach me what eternity means. Not because I am lost and you are saving me, but because we are both still here, and that has to mean something." Dimitri's hand covered hers. For the first time since the chapel, Eleanor felt the faintest hint of warmth. Not human warmth, but something like it, a memory of what warmth had once meant to him. "It will not be easy," he warned. "I am already damned," Eleanor replied. "What difference does a little difficulty make?" He made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been sorrow. Perhaps they had become the same thing for him. "The first test," Dimitri said, "is facing the dawn. For vampires, sunlight is not fire, but dissolution. The day will try to unmake you. You will need to sleep through it in the earth, in darkness, in places where no light penetrates. It is necessary. It is also one of the cruelest parts of this life." "Then let's begin," Eleanor said. "Let's find the darkness. Let's learn together." And as Dimitri led her deeper into the castle, toward the chambers beneath the stone, Eleanor understood that she had not been saved from death. She had been chosen for something far more complicated. The chance to become herself despite eternity, despite hunger, despite everything that the world would never understand about 2 broken things learning to exist in the same darkness. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. Chapter 4. The language of blood weeks passed in a rhythm Eleanor had never known, not the rhythm of seasons or daylight, but the rhythm of hunger and rest, of learning and transformation. She slept in the earth during the day, in a chamber deep beneath the castle where Dmitri had prepared a bed of soil and stones, and at night she emerged to feed. The first feeding had nearly destroyed her. Dmitri had brought her to a village at the edge of his lands, a place where livestock wandered in pens. He had explained, with the patience of someone who had taught this lesson before, that she would need to begin with animals. That the blood of humans carried memories, carried voices that would haunt her if she took a life before she was strong enough to bear the weight of it. Eleanor had resisted. She had spent her childhood being told she was barely human. She would not prove it by consuming lesser creatures. Pride, Dmitri had said coldly, is how the young immortals become monsters. Drink what you can live with. The rest comes later, if you choose it. She had drunk from a deer, and the experience had been exactly what she feared, humiliating and electric and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The animal's terror had flooded through her with its blood, its desperate, simple consciousness overwhelmed by her presence. When it fell, Eleanor had wept with a ferocity that surprised even herself. "You wept," Dmitri observed when she returned to the castle, her mouth still stained. "Of course I wept. I just murdered an innocent creature to survive." "No," he corrected. You participated in the cycle of life and death that your species has been part of since your beginning. The only difference is that now you feel it directly rather than through the distance of hired butchers. That is not weakness, Eleanor. That is the beginning of actual morality. Over the weeks, she had learned to move through the world as he did, not as a person, but as a force. She had learned that her blindness was no longer a handicap, but a gift. Humans saw her eyes and assumed impairment. They did not expect the deadly precision with which she could navigate darkness. Her other senses had sharpened to an almost unbearable acuity. She could taste a man's age in his blood, hear the patterns of disease in heartbeats, sense desire and fear radiating from living bodies like heat. And Dmitri had taught her the most important lesson of all, that power without restraint was just another word for monstrosity. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, he had said one night as they sat in the castle's library. Eleanor had begun to navigate it through touch, learning the shapes of books, though she could not read them. They chose eternity. That choice should mean something. It should change us into something better than we were, not worse. "And you?" Eleanor asked. "What were you when you chose?" Dmitri had been silent for a long time. A merchant's son in Prague, skilled with languages, ambitious beyond reason, arrogant enough to believe I could love someone I should not. When my wife discovered my affair with her lady's maid, she cursed me. She called for death and damnation. She got her wish, though not in the way she intended. A man came to me, the man who turned me, and offered me one choice: become nothing or become eternal. And you chose eternity. I chose to escape consequences. It took me 300 years to understand that escape and choice are not the same thing. Eleanor moved through the library toward him. Her hands found his face, traced the geography of it with a confidence that would have terrified the girl who knelt in the chapel weeks ago. Why does that matter now? Because you are different than I was. You did not choose this seeking power or escape. You chose it seeking meaning. That is rarer than you understand. Eleanor felt him lean into her touch, and for a moment the vast cold of him seemed to contract, to become something almost human in its need. "Show me," she said quietly. "Show me what you choose now, in the present, not in the memory of your past mistakes." Dmitri's hand rose to meet hers. "You are asking for something dangerous. I have already drunk blood. I have already died and been reborn. What is more dangerous than that? Connection, Dmitri said, and his voice carried the weight of all his centuries. We do not form bonds easily, Eleanor. When we do, they are absolute. The distance that separates vampires is not distance, but self-preservation. When I feel what I feel beginning to feel for you, then feel it, Eleanor interrupted. Feel it completely. I am not asking you to be careful anymore. I am asking you to be real. He pulled her close, and for the first time since her transformation, Eleanor felt warm, not with the warmth of living blood, but with something deeper. His mouth found hers with the precision of someone who had been waiting centuries for permission. They did not make love. Instead, they did something older and more fundamental. They fed from each other, carefully, deliberately, neither drawing enough to truly hurt, but enough to create a bond that Eleanor could feel settling into her very cells. Their blood mingled, and in that mingling, they shared something beyond memory. They shared essence. Eleanor tasted his loneliness, his guilt over his daughter, his 300 years of careful, methodical refusal to fully live. And Dmitri, tasting her, experienced the chapel, the slow dissolution of hope, the moment she had decided to surrender. But also, the moment after, the moment she had decided to choose. When they separated, Eleanor was trembling. This changes things, Dmitri said quietly. Good, Eleanor replied. I am tired of things staying the same. Outside, the sun was beginning its approach. Soon, Eleanor would need to return to the earth to sleep. But for these last few hours of night, she remained in his arms, learning the language of blood and choice, of two broken things that had somehow chosen not to break further. And in the depths of the castle, in the spaces between stone and time, it seemed almost possible that eternity might hold meaning after all. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Chapter 5. The Mirror's Question. 3 months into her transformation, Eleanor stood before something Dmitri called a mirror. She did not use it in the way humans did. Her blindness remained absolute, a fundamental part of her being that even immortality had not corrected. But Dmitri had explained that mirrors held information beyond vision. They reflected reality in ways that had nothing to do with sight. She had asked him to describe what she looked like now. Like someone caught between states, he had said. Your skin is paler than it was, but not deathly, more like marble that has been polished by time. Your hair has darkened. Your eyes, they are still blind, but they reflect light now in ways they did not before. You are beautiful in a way that frightens people. That is as it should be. Eleanor's fingers traced the surface of the mirror, finding it cold. Do I frighten you? Yes, Dmitri said simply. Not because of what you look like, but because of what I feel when I look at you. Immortals are not supposed to feel this strongly about anything. It is a weakness, a vulnerability. Or perhaps it is a strength, Eleanor suggested. Perhaps caring is not weakness, but proof that we have not become the monsters the world tells us we are. They had been building towards something, moving in circles around a question neither had explicitly asked. Eleanor felt it in the way Dmitri moved around her, always close, always careful not to touch too long. She felt it in the restraint of his feeding, the way he had begun to hunt alone, leaving Eleanor in the castle to read with her hands what she could not read with her eyes. I have been contacted, Dmitri said one night as they sat in what had once been the castle's chapel. Ironic, Eleanor thought, that after the chapel had nearly killed her, she would find herself in another one, but transformed by knowledge rather than despair. By whom? Eleanor asked. Others like us. There is a gathering happening in the south, in the old Carpathian monasteries. Vampires from across Europe are being called together. There is friction. The old ones believe the world is changing too quickly, that we are becoming too visible, too careless. Younger vampires are arguing for adaptation, for integration. Some are demanding the right to live without hiding. Eleanor absorbed this. She had been so focused on learning to exist in this new form that she had not considered that there were others, communities, politics, conflicts beyond just the two of them and their castle in the gray stone night. "Are you going?" she asked. "I do not know. I have avoided other vampires for 300 years. Being around them requires a kind of vulnerability I am not certain I possess anymore." He paused. "And I do not know if I want to leave you." Eleanor's heart, which still beat, though slowly, accelerated. "Why would you have to leave me?" "Because what you are suggesting with your question is that you want to remain here indefinitely, and that is not a fair choice to ask you to make. You have been immortal for barely 3 months, Eleanor. There is an entire existence to discover, an entire world beyond these walls." Eleanor stood and walked to the chapel's window. She could not see outside, but she could feel the night air, smell the pine forests beyond the castle's walls, sense the vast weight of the world beyond. "I did not choose this to explore the world," she said. "I chose this to not be alone. Everything else is secondary to that." "That will change," Dmitri warned. "Eternity has a way of changing what feels important. 50 years from now, you will be restless. 500 years from now, you will have forgotten what it felt like to kneel in a chapel and wait for death." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, "but I will remember how I felt in this castle, in your arms, tasting your blood and knowing I was not alone anymore. And perhaps that will be enough to carry me through the centuries that follow." Dmitri moved beside her. In the darkness, they were equals. "The gathering is in 2 months. I think we should attend." Eleanor turned toward him. "Why?" "Because you cannot build a future on isolation, and because if we are going to defy the traditional ways of our kind, if we are going to prove that immortals can choose connection over predation, mercy over hunger, we need to do it where we will be seen. We need to make a statement." "That sounds dangerous." "It is," Dmitri agreed. "But so is love, and we have already chosen that." Eleanor reached for his face. Her hands had become expert at reading him through touch, the planes of his cheekbones, the line of his jaw, the invisible tears that sometimes ran down his face when he thought she was asleep. "Then we will be dangerous together," she said. "We will go to your gathering, and we will show them what the old ones have forgotten, that immortality is not a curse to endure, but a gift to be shared, that mercy is more powerful than hunger." "You believe that?" Dmitri asked, and she could hear the doubt in his voice. "I believe that I am alive only because you chose mercy when you could have chosen to ignore me. I believe that we are not monsters unless we accept that as our destiny. I believe that we have been given centuries to become something better than the world said we were, and I believe that we can do it, together." Dmitri pulled her close. Through the chapel's old stones, Eleanor could almost hear the echoes of other prayers, not for salvation, but for transformation, for the possibility that even the damned might find grace. "Then let us prepare," Dmitri said. "Let us learn what we need to learn, and let us go to face whatever comes." And Eleanor, who had been left to die in a chapel, now stood in another chapel with an immortal vampire at her side, ready to face an entire world that had never believed in redemption through love. She was no longer afraid. She had already died once. What was the worst that eternity could offer her now? Chapter 6. The Gathering of Thorns. The monastery rose from the Carpathian mist like a wound in the earth. Eleanor sensed it long before Dmitri described it. The weight of centuries of prayer and blood had soaked into the stones so deeply that even she could feel it, like pressure on her skin, like the presence of ghosts given form through architecture. "There are more than 200 of us," Dmitri said quietly as they approached. "Some have traveled for weeks. The oldest among them date back to times when Christ was still considered a novelty. Be careful what you say, Eleanor. Vampires do not forgive careless words." Eleanor had transformed so completely over the past months that she found it difficult to remember the girl in the chapel. She had fed on human blood now, carefully, after hunting animals for weeks, after Dmitri had taught her how to taste the end of a person's life in the moment before it came. She had learned that humans were not so different from deer in their final moments, except that their consciousness remained for longer, their fear more complex and layered. The worst part was that she had learned to enjoy it. "I am ready," she told Dmitri, though she was not certain this was true. The monastery's interior was a cathedral of shadow and movement. Eleanor moved through it guided by sound, by the presence of other immortals whose breathing she could distinguish from the stone's echo. Some were ancient, their presence so weighed down by time that they seemed like stone themselves. Others were young, burning with the fever of recent transformation. Dmitri led her to a chamber where a circle had been formed. At its center sat an ancient vampire, a woman whose age Eleanor could taste in the very air around her. She was so old that she had begun to calcify, to become more memory than presence. "Dmitri," the woman said, her voice like wind through ruins, "you leave your castle after 3 centuries, and you bring with you a fresh-turned vampire, barely old enough to understand the weight of her own existence. This is unexpected. This is Eleanor," Dmitri said, and Eleanor heard the protective note in his voice. "She is my chosen. I have brought her to the gathering because her presence here represents something we must discuss. She was not turned by hunger or the cruelty of transformation. She was turned by mercy, by choice, by the deliberate decision to save a life rather than consume it." A murmur moved through the chamber. Eleanor could feel the skepticism, the ancient doubt of beings who had spent centuries believing that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. "Mercy is a luxury," another vampire said, this one male, his voice carrying the weight of armies and centuries of conquest. "It is what the weak practice to justify their weakness. We are predators, Dmitri. We are apex creatures. Why would we constrain ourselves with mercy?" Eleanor stepped forward. "Because," she said, her voice steady though she was terrified, "if you do not constrain yourselves, you become what the humans believe you are. You become monsters. But if you choose restraint, if you choose to feed but not to destroy unnecessarily, then you become something else. Something that can exist alongside humanity without obliterating it." "Pretty words from a maiden who has been immortal for scarcely a season," the male vampire said dismissively. Eleanor turned toward his voice. "I have been blind since birth. I have been abandoned, nearly starved, and written off as a curse. I know what it is to be considered less than human. I know what it is to be told that your existence is an embarrassment, a burden on the world. The difference between me and you is that I could have chosen to become those things. I could have become the monster I was told I was. Instead, I chose to listen when someone offered me another option. You have been immortal for centuries, and you still have not learned that lesson." The ancient woman in the center made a sound, not quite laughter, but something close. "I like her," she said. "She has courage or stupidity. Sometimes they are indistinguishable." "She has truth," another voice said, this one female, older than Eleanor but not ancient. Eleanor sensed something familiar in her presence. "Dmitri is correct. The world is changing. Humans are developing technology that will eventually allow them to see in our darkness, to hunt us with instruments instead of belief and superstition. We can either adapt, which means coexisting more peacefully with them, or we can retreat further, become even more isolated. A third option is to wage war, but that only hastens our mutual extinction." "And what of nature, Elena?" another vampire asked. "What of our hunger? You speak as if we can simply choose not to be what we are." Eleanor felt Dmitri's hand find hers in the darkness. She understood, in that moment, that this gathering was not about her or Dmitri. It was about the future of their entire species, about whether immortals would remain locked in endless cycles of predation and hiding, or whether they could evolve, could become something more. "I have drunk human blood," Eleanor said quietly. I have hunted. I have felt the moment of death pass from one being to another through the exchange of my own hunger. It is extraordinary and terrible. But here is what I learned. The hunger does not diminish if you give it what it wants. It only grows. The only thing that has ever diminished my hunger is the memory of mercy. The memory of Dmitri choosing to save me rather than consume me. That is more powerful than any feed, any kill. That is the addictive substance we should be pursuing. The old woman stood. Eleanor sensed the movement through the air's displacement, felt the weight of centuries suddenly focused on her like a physical force. The gathering will take 3 nights, the ancient one said. We will debate the old ways and the new. But I think, young Eleanor, that your presence here has already changed the outcome. You have reminded us that we were human once, and humans, for all their flaws, are capable of mercy. The question we must answer is whether immortality should obliterate that capacity or whether it should elevate it. Eleanor felt Dmitri's grip on her hand tighten. I am not interested in changing what we are, Eleanor said. I am only interested in suggesting that what we are is not fixed. That becoming immortal does not have to mean becoming evil. It can mean becoming wise. The gathering dissolved into conversation. Eleanor was approached by dozens of vampires, some hostile, some curious, a few actually interested in genuine dialogue about what it meant to exist outside the traditional boundaries of their kind. It was past dawn before Dmitri led her to a chamber deep in the monastery's heart, where sunlight could not penetrate. They sank into the earth together, and as Eleanor felt the sleep of the undead drawing her down, she heard Dmitri whisper against her ear, You have changed them, or at least, you have changed what they are willing to acknowledge about themselves. That is dangerous, Eleanor. There are those who will want you dead for it. Then we will face them, Eleanor replied, and let the darkness claim her. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance. Chapter 7. The choice between hunger and heart months passed after the gathering. Eleanor and Dmitri returned to the castle, but the world had shifted. Other vampires began to visit, first secretly, then openly. They wanted to speak with Eleanor, to understand this philosophy of restraint and mercy that she and Dmitri represented. Some came seeking conversion, others came seeking confrontation. One night, a young vampire arrived at the castle gates. He was freshly turned, no more than a year into his transformation, and he carried the fever of new hunger like a fever. I want to learn, he told Eleanor when Dmitri brought him to her. His name was Victor, and he had been turned against his will by a vampire who had abandoned him. I have killed 17 people in the past year. I cannot stop. My hunger is consuming me. Eleanor sat with him in the castle's library, her hands tracing the ancient books while she spoke. You believe your hunger is absolute, that it controls you rather than you controlling it. It is, Victor said desperately. Every moment, every breath, I am fighting it. I can smell the blood in the servants' veins. I can hear their heartbeats. It is agony. Yes, Eleanor said, it is agony. Dmitri once told me that immortals do not form bonds easily, and when they do, the bonds are absolute. Hunger is the same way. The more you feed it, the more absolute it becomes. The only way to break that cycle is to deny it. You ask me to deny my nature. No, Eleanor said. I ask you to define your nature for yourself rather than accepting the definition given to you by the vampire who turned you without permission. You are hungry. That much is true. But hunger is not destiny. You are also capable of thought, of choice, of something deeper than the instinct to consume. Victor left the castle without committing to anything, but Eleanor could tell that something in her words had struck him. It was the first of many such visits. What Eleanor did not tell anyone, not even Dmitri, was that the visits were costing her. Each interaction with a struggling vampire required her to relive her own transformation, to remember the chapel, to remember her own hunger and the way she had learned to master it. The accumulated weight of all these memories was beginning to crack something inside her. "You are disappearing," Dmitri finally said one night as they lay in the castle's highest tower, watching, or rather, listening to, the stars. "No," Eleanor replied. "I am remembering. They are the same thing. For someone like you, memory is a kind of death." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. "I was brought to this life as a mercy. I have spent the past year extending that mercy to others. But I have begun to realize something, Dmitri. Mercy is not sustainable. Eventually, you run out of the capacity to give it. You run out of the ability to see suffering and choose restraint rather than consumption." "Then stop," Dmitri said. "Tell them to leave. Seal the castle. We can return to what we had before, just the two of us in the darkness, feeding on animals and each other's blood." Eleanor turned her face toward his. "Could you do that? Could you abandon them knowing what you know about suffering?" "To keep you," Dmitri said, his voice breaking, "I could do almost anything." "That is the problem," Eleanor said. "That is why immortality is a curse, not a gift. You are forced to choose between the people you love and the people you could save. You cannot choose both. Eventually, you must sacrifice one for the other." Dmitri pulled her closer. "Then what are you going to do?" Eleanor leaned against him, feeling the cold reality of what she had to do settling over her like snow. "I am going to make a choice that will hurt both of us. But it is the only choice that gives this suffering meaning." The next morning, before the sun rose, Eleanor left a letter in Dmitri's chamber. It was written in raised script that he could feel with his fingers, a language only immortals truly understood, the language of pain made into meaning. "I love you," the letter said. "That is why I must leave. I have realized that my purpose in this life is not to love you or to hide with you in a castle. It is to spread the philosophy of mercy across all of the immortal world, to teach others what you taught me, that we are not prisoners of our hunger, that we can choose restraint, that we can choose to be something better than the world tells us we are. This will take centuries. It will require me to leave you, to move through the world, to face those who believe I am a traitor to our kind. It will hurt both of us in ways that nothing else can hurt immortals. But if I do not do this, everything we survived, the chapel, the transformation, the gathering, it all becomes meaningless. It becomes just another story of two people in love, hidden away from the world. I need you to understand that my love for you is not diminished by my leaving. It is transformed. It becomes something that powers every conversation I have with a struggling vampire, every person I save from becoming a monster, every small mercies I extend. Find someone else, Dmitri, or find solitude, but do not wait for me. That would be too cruel an immortality for both of us. Forgive me, and believe always that you made me capable of this choice. You gave me eternity. You showed me it was possible to choose restraint. Now I must choose to use that gift for something larger than ourselves. Eternally yours, Eleanor. Dmitri found the letter as the sun rose. Eleanor was already gone, traveling east toward Hungary, toward the networks of immortals that she had begun to build during the past months. She did not look back, though her heart, still beating despite the centuries it would continue to beat, broke with each mile of distance she put between herself and the castle. She had chosen eternity, but not the eternity Dmitri had offered her. She had chosen an eternity of purpose, of struggle, of slow and painful redemption. It was a harder choice, but it was hers. And in the chapel where she had knelt and waited to die, she understood finally it had always been her choice, even in the darkness, especially in the darkness. Follow for more immortal confessions born from blood and mercy. Chapter 8. The Mercy of Eternity. 500 years later, Eleanor stood in what had once been a monastery, watching moonlight filter through ruined windows. The world had transformed around her in ways she could never have imagined. Humans now hunted with technology instead of torches. The old ways of vampires were crumbling, and the philosophy of restraint and mercy that she had spent centuries spreading had become, if not universal, at least undeniable. The monastery had become a sanctuary for reformed vampires and newly turned immortals seeking an alternative to the predatory cycles they had inherited. Eleanor had filled its halls with teachers, healers, philosophers. She had built a library of experiences, testimonies from immortals who had chosen mercy, who had spent centuries learning to coexist with humans, who had discovered that restraint was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Victor, the young vampire who had come to her 5 centuries ago, burning with uncontrollable hunger, was now one of her most devoted followers. He had become a teacher himself, helping other struggling immortals break the cycles of violence that had defined their first decades of immortality. Eleanor, a young woman called, hurrying through the monastery's corridors. Her name was Magdalena, and she had been turned only months ago. "We have received word. The ancient council is calling for a vote. They want to formally recognize mercy as a legitimate path for our kind." Eleanor smiled. It was such a small thing, really. A formal vote. A recognition that changed nothing materially and yet changed everything fundamentally. But it represented something she had worked toward for 5 centuries. The acknowledgement that immortality did not have to mean damnation. "And Dmitri?" Eleanor asked carefully. She asked this question of every messenger, every immortal who came through the monastery. She had not seen him in 500 years. She had not allowed herself to. "He is coming to the council," Magdalena said. "He wants to speak." Eleanor's heart, which had continued to beat despite everything, began to accelerate. She moved through the monastery toward its highest tower, toward the place where she went when she needed to think. The tower overlooked the valley where the monastery stood, and in the moonlight, the landscape looked almost like a painting. All silver and shadow, depth and possibility. She did not know what to expect when Dmitri arrived. 500 years was enough time to heal, but it was also enough time for wounds to calcify, to become part of your basic structure. She had not allowed herself to think about him too deeply, because thinking about him meant admitting how much she missed him, how much the separation had cost. He came at dusk, as the sun was beginning its descent. Eleanor heard him before she saw him, the way his footsteps carried the weight of centuries, the way his presence displaced the air around him. "You have built something remarkable," Dmitri said, stepping into the tower. Eleanor turned. 500 years had changed her appearance. She looked less like the blind maiden from the chapel and more like what she actually was. A revolutionary, a teacher, a being who had learned to transform pain into purpose. "I built what you made possible," Eleanor said. "You showed me that mercy was a choice. I simply extended that choice to others." "I have been watching," Dmitri admitted. "Not constantly, not obsessively, but I have always known where you were, what you were doing. I am proud of you, Eleanor, even though I was angry for the first century and heartbroken for the second, and then I began to understand. You gave your love to the world, and in doing so, you made the world into something that deserves to receive that love." "And what have you done?" Eleanor asked. "In 500 years?" "Waited," Dmitri said simply, "not for you to return, but for you to succeed. I knew that if you could teach even one generation of immortals that there was an alternative to predation, then everything I had lived through, all the centuries of loneliness, all the guilt over my daughter, all the years in the castle watching the world change, then all of that would finally mean something." Eleanor moved toward him. Her blindness had never truly limited her. Even now, 500 years later, she navigated the world through sound and presence and the deep knowing that came from attention rather than sight. "I missed you," she said. "I know," Dmitri replied. "I felt it. Every act of mercy you extended, I felt it like an echo of us, of what we had created in that castle before you left. They did not touch. It seemed important not to, as if touching might collapse the distance between them, might undo all the work they had both done, the separate paths they had chosen. "Do you regret it?" Dmitri asked. "Leaving?" "Every day," Eleanor said. "And also never. It was the right choice, even though it was the most painful choice I have ever made." "That is the nature of immortality," Dmitri said. "Every choice is eternal. There is no moving past it, no escaping its consequences. You are bound to your decisions forever." "Is that why you came?" Eleanor asked. "To remind me of that?" "No," Dmitri said. "I came to tell you that I am ready now. I have spent 500 years in solitude, understanding what it means that you chose something larger than us. Now, I would like to spend the next 500 years, or the next 5,000, helping you, if you will have me." Eleanor felt something shift inside her, not healing exactly, but acceptance. 500 years of separation had not broken her love for him. It had transformed it into something deeper, something that could survive in the world and also return, like breath, like blood, like the eternal cycle of life and death that immortals had learned to respect rather than deny. "Yes," she said, "but not in the way we were before. We cannot return to the castle, Dmitri. That time has passed." "I know," he said. "I am not asking for the past. I am asking for the future, for the chance to help you teach the world that even the damned can choose redemption." Eleanor reached out then, and her hand found his face. 500 years had not changed the cold of him, the impossible smooth texture of a being who had stopped aging the moment he chose eternity. "Then welcome home," she said. "Welcome to the monastery. Welcome to the work of spreading mercy across an immortal world that is slowly, finally, beginning to believe it is possible." Dmitri pulled her close, and they stood in the tower as night fell. Two immortals who had learned that love was not a reward for the perfect, but a choice that the broken could make. They had been separated by 1,000 miles and 500 years, but the thread that connected them had never broken. It had simply been rewoven into something larger than themselves, a philosophy of mercy that was slowly transforming the world. In the chapel where Eleanor had knelt as a human girl waiting for death, a young vampire knelt now, not in despair, but in hope. And in 1,000 other monasteries and cities and hidden places across the world, others who had been turned and broken and lost were learning the same lesson, that immortality was a choice, and that choice could be mercy. The vampire king had heard the prayers of a blind maiden in a chapel, but in the end she had become something far more powerful than a victim saved by a monster. She had become a voice that echoed across centuries, teaching all of immortal kind that the most supernatural power was not the ability to take life, but the ability to choose not to. And in the darkness of 500 years of separation, Eleanor and Dmitri had learned that some loves are too infinite to be contained in one lifetime or one body or one castle. Some loves belong to the world, and some choices, once made, reverberate through eternity. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.